pipeline is anything but. The pipeline would move more than 1 million barrels of Western crude every day to Eastern Canada. But the premiers of Ontario and Quebec are now saying they've got some conditions they would like met first. Now, that's not sitting all that well with Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall. He joins me on the phone. Premier Wall, good morning.
Good morning.
What was your reaction when you heard that your counterparts from Ontario and Quebec are putting conditions on their support of this pipeline project?
A little surprised. A lot of what they were talking about, what they want to see is reasonable, and it's actually part of the National Energy Board process for approval. I mean, there needs to be consultation with communities. It's already underway. Hundreds of consultations have already occurred. There needs to be consultations with First Nations. I think TransCanada already has over 50 agreements with First Nations, and we need to make sure the pipeline's done in a safe way. Remembering, of course, that this is mostly a conversion and not a construction. What concerns me, though, Dave, it is this talk around GHGs, because this represents something very difficult to quantify, hard to define. Are we talking about the total GHG footprint, and then what does that mean? It represents, for me anyway, moving goalposts around a project, and I think that's a problem. That poses a barrier to this project.
To be clear, just for our listeners, to be clear, you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions and how discussions about that have come into this pipeline project, correct?
Which are not part of the National Energy Board process and are really never been part of the measure for a pipeline. And if this is what we're going to start applying to the movement of goods and services between the provinces, this is a very dangerous precedent. We need to remind everyone across the country what this project represents. It represents replacing the need for Eastern Canada to import foreign oil, as they're doing today. They buy oil from Iraq and Algeria, United States, Saudi Arabia. We're saying Canadians should be able to buy Canadian oil. We need to remember that without a pipeline, conventional oil, light sweet crude from the back end in our province, will move by rail car. We know that's not the best, not the safest way to move energy. We've lived through horrific tragedies on this count here very recently in this country. So I cannot understand for the life of me why on this particular pipeline project we see what in my view is unnecessary political barriers being put up.
From an Alberta perspective, so we've now seen Ontario and Quebec talk about conditions around their approval. We've seen BC Premier Christy Clark make a similar move with the Northern Gateway pipeline. Is this a trend, premiers using pipelines as negotiating chips?
I think it is. I don't know. One's maybe an exception, and two gets a little concerning. Three, I guess you include Keystone in this regard, and that's not necessarily the premise of your question, but it's a pipeline that's basically been stalled. And in that case, for some of these GHG contrivances in terms of reasoning, I think we should be concerned in Western Canada. We're Canada's second largest producer of oil here in Saskatchewan. We have the largest conventional play in the Bakken Formation. Still, though, as energy-producing provinces, we should be concerned. We need to move this product to Tidewater, where we can get full value for the owners of the resource, which is not the government and not the companies, but the people of Alberta and Saskatchewan Canadians. And, if we start to use GHG as a measure for imports, what will that do to the country, where we already have unnecessary barriers interprovincially to trade? I have a concern about it. We are an energy power. We need to get comfortable with that and acknowledge that it's a positive thing to have a country committed to sustainable energy development in a position of power in the world, and that's Canada. And yet, large parts of the country do not seem comfortable at all with the fact that we're good at producing oil and we're getting better at it in terms of, the environmental sustainability around oil development.
Premier, there are those in this province who would equate this pipeline with other huge projects in Canadian history, whether they talk about the creation of the railroad or the Trans-Canada Highway. Both of those projects only went through because of a driving, hard-forcing federal government. Do you wonder where the federal government is in all of this?
Well, I hope they are very determined on this. They've set up a very rigorous process that is the NEB process, that asks very difficult questions, that forces the company to actually provide dollars, along with the federal government, to groups like First Nations so they can participate in the hearings. This process canvasses all of the issues. So if it gets the green light from the National Energy Board, we absolutely need that kind of leadership from the federal government. I think when Canadians understand, too, what this pipeline is and isn't, that it is conventional oil, that it replaces oil from places like Algeria and Venezuela, by the way, that have a larger GHG footprint in the case of some of that Venezuelan oil. When people understand the facts of that most of the economic benefit for the pipeline, most of the new tax revenue accrues to Ontario principally, and then Quebec, and then the rest of the country, I think that Canadians will want their federal government to get, to provide leadership and get this done. This is an important national project, and Saskatchewan, we're going to do whatever we can to lend a voice of support and to advocate in favor of this very common sense project.
I understand you've spoken with Alberta Premier Jim Prentice about this. He says he'll be meeting with the Ontario and Quebec premiers at the beginning of next month. What do you hope comes out of that meeting?
Well, I've had a chance to talk to Premier Couillard, not yet with Premier Wynne. I hope common sense prevails. Everything on their list of concerns is reasonable, and all of that will be met and answered by the NEB process, which is in its initial stages. And I think TransCanada, as I mentioned earlier, has concluded a lot of the meetings already. Those concerns can be answered. The greenhouse gas piece, that we might have to work hard to make the case against that. It's really quite absurd. In our province, we have steel fabricators convinced that through subsidies of the central governments of Ontario and Quebec, there's an advantage for the import of steel, and they're concerned here. If we were to say, look, we're not going to allow any Ontario and Quebec steel, and we're going to take a pause here based on a GHG analysis of the footprint around steel fabricating, well, obviously that would seem to be, to the people in Ontario and Quebec, quite the wrong way to go, maybe even absurd. This is precisely the point we're making about this one demand that the premiers of Ontario and Quebec are now seemingly wanting to place on Energy East.
Premier Wall, thank you very much for taking the time to join us this morning. I appreciate it.
Have a good day.
Brad Wall is the Premier of Saskatchewan.